So I'm going to try and be quick about this because I know I'm the talk right before lunch, so I stand between the food and your stomach. So my talk today is about cell phone and landline telephone use in rural Mexico. This is part of a larger dissertation project on comparing mobility, and so my other work is in China looking at internal migrants, and the comparison here is with international migrants who are going between Mexico and US, and I'm interested in how people who are constantly mobile and flow and flux and how they're using new communication technology. So the second part of this project is where we're presenting I'm going to present some preliminary findings on what we found, because what we did was we first went in with the ethnographic approach and really just wanted to map out what was going on in this village. And the third part that we're going to be doing is the technology deployment part, where this is where I would like for you guys to keep in mind, because I'm not a technologist, I'm a sociologist, is how we want to collaborate with people who have some technologies out there, and we want to be able to co-develop this technology with the village and look at what their needs are. And so these are some preliminary findings. Our two research questions are, who are the new technology users of this village, and what are some emerging practices? And we're looking at this really not just from a social point of view, but my approach is very cultural in that we have these large social processes of migration, but what's the specific cultural use of the technology here in the context? And that's, I think, the interesting part in looking at what makes the technology work or not. The literature that we're addressing here is some of the migration and globalization literature that just kind of assumes once people in emerging or developing regions get technology, all of a sudden, magic happens and there's more social connections and everyone's communicating more. And then the second literature we're sort of addressing is just studies that have looked at where first adopters tend to be mobile professionals. So usually there's an assumption there's some kind of local economy around the area, or where they have to leave the village to do something around economy. So our research site is in Bichuhini, Oaxaca. If you can see, there's, the top part is the United States, so we're pretty far down south near Guatemala. And the geography of Bichuhini is it's very mountainous terrain. So even though from Oaxaca City, the largest city in the state of Oaxaca, and the capital of Oaxaca, is only 90 miles, but on the van ride through the mountains, it's actually a 6 to 8 hour van ride, depending on what car you're stuck behind or your driver of the day. So the population is anywhere from 500 to 900, depending on how many migrants are in or out of town. So it's a largely subsistence economy, and it's located on a highway that was just built 40 years ago. The housing, is mainly made out of metal, some concrete or wood if you have the more well-off migrant families, where they definitely have more family members in the United States. And you still have houses without electricity, and there's no running water in most homes. Education is, very low literacy rates, low levels of education. It's an, indigenous Mixtecan community, so you have a lot of people where Spanish isn't even their first language, and most people don't know how to write, at least the older people. But because it's a recent migration sending village, there's a lot more flow of money coming in. So that means there's flow of new access to things. So we wanted to look at what are the dynamics first that allowed people to purchase new technology. And a lot of this relies on remittance money. So in the top picture, remittances are just, where migrants send money back to their home village or town. And so here's a picture of McDonald's in Southern California, which is where they send all their migrants. And you have the migrants, going to McDonald's at cash check-in place, and they're sending their money to Mexico. And what happens on the Mexico end is that the women are the ones who are in charge of the finances. So it's a kind of flip. And you do have a large population imbalance. So what this means is that, when we did a survey of, how migrants are spending their money, mostly still it's all on subsistence, as you can see, over 71%. So no one answered technology or when we did give that option. And this also means there's a large youth population that declines rapidly because they tend to leave starting around the age of 18. So you have 60, and this is the Mexican census in 2005, and the snapshot of that is you have 60 youth, between 10 and 14, and it drops down to 13 between 25 and 29. And that also means the gender index is, very unbalanced. For every 100 females, we have about 85 males in Bichuhini. So our methodology for going in was our first stage is we conducted quantitative studies. So we did at individual level. And these questions range from everything from asking about their migration history, education, to their material possessions, to where their family is from. And the second step was a qualitative part where we did informal interviews with 10 people and over 40 hours of participant observation in the village center. And then the third step, which, so I was, mostly the second and third was largely where I was overseeing it. And so the third step was a lot of the conversations and information I was able to find out was all from informal online instant messaging communication. So it's really interesting that there are the nearest internet cafe is about 20 minutes away. So this talk today is just about cell phones, but what I was looking at was overall new technology that they were using. So I was able to keep in touch with 2 to 3 male informants, and I'll just tell you later why they're only male. But this was a really interesting way to think about a new kind of methodology where you're able to still do field work but away from the field. And how do you keep as you're going through your data afterwards, because it's still a constant process, how do you use talk to your informants over IM. So these are some of our initial findings about cell phone users in Bichuhini, is that the first adopters of cell phone are primarily youth who attend school in another town. So these are families where they're able to at least pay a little more for their son or daughter to go to another school. And this town is about 15 to 20 minutes away. And a lot of the older and newer technology is being used alongside together. And what was really interesting was the kind of time I spent inside the caseta. And the caseta is the primary mode for local landline communication between, it's the only landline in the town is what we found out, was that this is something we didn't know until going into the field, was that with Telemex, the policy is that for villages under 1,000 people, you can only have one landline going into the village. So a caseta, this was the caseta outside, and a caseta, there's, that one monitor of how much, this is how they calculate, the voltage of the phone cost, and this is where it was located, next to a lot of new pictures and calendars that were sent to them from different companies. And it also, as you see, there's a big, megaphone on top. And when people call in, what they do is they announce that, here's the caller, and then they say, call back in 5 or 10, 15 minutes, depending how far away the person lives in the mountains. And that person has to walk over. So there's a lot of, local knowledge here about distance and space over how people walk around. So there's 2 lines, and you go in, and there's 2 of these booths, and you can fit about 2 people inside a booth. And it's also a little store. So it's the only store in the town, the only landline in the town. So what I observed was that, majority of calls were placed by older people or with a wife or spouse in the United States. And it was very informal. People would take out their phone numbers. It was crumpled on pieces of paper. And what we found out was that there was a lot more calls obviously being received than placed, because it's more expensive for them to make calls to the U.S. And most of their calls were received on the weekends and from the U.S. So what was interesting was to think about this alongside new technology for cell phone. And what I observed was that I never actually observed anyone making a phone call in the village. And so it was really interesting, because they would always take the phone out of their pockets and play with it. And immediately when they came back from school or from out of town, they were just constantly keeping it within arm's reach. But they never made a phone call. And so what I found out was that, they would only use the phone when they're away from the village. And I think this is really interesting to think about when you're thinking about what kind of technology you're developing, what's useful, and how it's going to be used. And what we found out was that they don't send text messages between friends. And this is just a snapshot of right now. So things could, obviously change when prices and things go down in the next few years. But there's just one phone per family. And it was the mothers who made the purchase of the phone, which is what I found out from the youth. And so possible explanations for why youth are the first users is that, in a way, they're kind of the primary income earners in the U.S. And so the fathers are sending remittances home. So it's only children who have, this kind of father in the United States who are able to do this. So they become this proxy for symbolic status. Because there was a large divide between youth who have cell phones, and large divide between youth who don't have cell phones.
And it's an interesting thing about remittances, if it's the wife who controls the finances, it's the women, it's only youth, who have this migrant family who can afford this. So women play this instrumental role, and as mothers, they play an instrumental role in making sure that the cell phone is purchased. And it could also be for safety reasons, and that if they're the ones being mobile and they're the ones going away. And the reason why I would think that they're the only youth, they're mobile, is because there's no local economy. So if you think about it, there's really no room for the mobile professional. So some unexpected social usage of the phone that some things that we can think about is that it starts to symbolize, wealth and identity. So it's the unexpected, usage. And there's a new boundary between youth with and without phones. And also to think about how it builds on existing inequalities between migrant and non-migrant families. But also in another way, point 4, is thinking about symbolic meaning between family members, is that this could also mean like, well, I trust you enough so that this is a way to build trust, that I let you go farther away. Or it's a way for mothers to feel comfortable about their youth going farther away, because there were youth who were in town, a few hours away, and they said that, they would call home much more often. But if we're thinking about it, though, is that if there's if there's only one cell phone per family, what happens is that in Bichuhini there's one caseta, and so from the United States, people are using their landlines to call Bichuhini, and this is confirmed because we've studied now the receiving end, which I think is really important to not when you're studying migration, populations, is you have to look on the other end of what's going on. So. The other end of it is, yes, they are using landlines to call back from the U.S. But for the youth that are going 15, 30 minutes away and they're using cell phones, they're only calling back Bichuhini, is what we found out. And they're only calling the caseta, because there's only one phone per family. So that's another thing to think about as you're developing technology, is that, there's only one phone, one side, and how does it interface with the caseta? So bridging some of the things we observed to the existing literature is that, what we observe is that cell phones actually reinforce family ties within a village, because it allows the youth who goes farther away to call back, and that the caseta, enforces transborder ties between the U.S. and Mexico. And, newer technology is being used alongside older tech, and first adopters here are mobile immigrant youth. So just some lessons that we learned in the field was that there's definitely selection bias in gender, because I only spoke with males because most of the times the girls were inside the house. So I couldn't get inside the homes as I was mainly working outside. And to look at, the telecommunication policy, how a large social policy can make a large impact culturally on the way people use tech. And just as an interesting case, that there was confusion in telecommunication concepts that our quantitative surveys couldn't answer, that only through ethnography we could find out, was that what we found out was that a fijo, which we thought means it is a fixed line, since there is no such thing as a landline. So when we ask people, do you have a fijo, and they call it a fijo, it's actually not a landline. We found out that people actually have these sometimes cellular phones. They're run by satellite, and so it's technically cellular, but it's not mobile. So there's this new division to think about what's mobile and what's not. And so the way we asked the question didn't really work. So when we asked people how many people own a fijo, 13 people said yes, but so we thought that first meant landline. But then when we asked for how many people own a mobile, only 67 people said yes. So we found out that a lot of people thought fijo was mobile. So only through ethnography could we find this stuff out. So our next phase is that we're going to be doing more we're going to actually go into the co-development phase with the village. And so what we want to keep in mind is not to intensify any, the inequalities, and to make sure we emphasize at all points we're co-developing with the village. So part of this is that I'm pretty strict on saying that, we never use the word help, or we never use the word develop, is that it's always used in the context of what do you think would help, your situation, the village. And that we never say that we're going in to develop anything, that we're co-developing. So this, we found out, makes a big difference with the way that the village leaders and the older people in the village don't see it as coming with new technologies, working with the youth. So, first adopters are youth in here, and it's interesting to keep in mind the relationship between the caseta and the cell phones. And we're still going to be doing more follow-up field work and to inform the next phase. That's it.
Thanks, Tricia. I think this is a great study. You mentioned at the end that you were interested in doing a technology deployment. What's the problem that conceivably might be addressed by a technology?
Right, well, there's a lot of things that we would think would be problems, so that's why I try not to say help, because I don't want to be normative about it, just because. But what we've heard from the village is that there's a lot of issues with water, a lot of issues with, they just want they want constant connection with the internet, but they have to go 20 minutes away to the nearest internet cafe. There are places where their cell phones don't work. But a lot of these things I think are also not just tech problems, but they have a lot of like social concerns between generations. Like the one thing I think is something important to think about is everyone has identified that the town's population is rapidly declining. They don't know what to do about youth going away, and how do you make sure that there's a return, migration. And that's already in place, but it's falling apart. So there's things that we've thought, well, how can we make sure that whatever technology, we make sure we co-develop. Yes, there's a technology part, but what's the social and cultural part that also addresses, their concerns. So I think a lot of the stuff here I've heard, there's a lot of interest here that I would like to talk to people about, and then bring those ideas back to the village when we go back in December. But education is another one. So health can go on for a role, in migrant village.
Okay, great. So I think we can break for lunch, and we'll all ask each other questions there.